In 1788, Arthur Phillip arrived from England with 6 non-Indigenous men for every non-Indigenous woman. When the women were disembarked, Surgeon Arthur Bowes Smith wrote, "The convicts got to them very soon after their landing. The scene of debauchery and riot that ensued during that night may be better conceived than expressed." Some historians who have read the contemporary accounts of that event have given it a different name: unrelenting rape that lasted for days. Governor Phillip said, "The lusts of the men were so urgent as to require the prostitution of the most abandoned women to contain them." He petitioned London to send more women. On July 29th of 1789, the Lady Juliana arrived in Sydney with more than 220 women, many of whom were classified as London prostitutes. They joined the women of the First Fleet and had no effective protection. They were grossly outnumbered, they had no institutional safety, they were intended to prostitute themselves, and whether they did this to one man or to many, women who did not accept were subject to violence or worse. We know from Henry Reynolds that there were some 15 non-Indigenous men for every non-Indigenous woman along the Aboriginal frontier, a frontier that didn't close until the Coniston Massacre of 1928. There hasn't been a lot of research into the government-tolerated sex trade along the frontier, but we know from Reynolds that there was a constant trade in First Nation women from Bass Strait whalers to Northern Territory pastoral leases to West Australian pearlers. We know that just as the native police were drafted to enact atrocities, there were times when one group would abduct the women of another group and trade them. It wasn't just the convicts or the Indigenous who were put at risk by institutional subjugation, enforced whoredom. We know that the gender imbalance mandated by early institutional decisions was the excuse given for importing poor English and Irish women. They were shipped in. They were distributed from various centres, including the Hyde Park Barracks, what was then the Women's Immigration Depot, from 1848 through to 1886. If you think about it, this mimicked the high-class sex trade. Just like Napoleon's Josephine, these women were pimped out to individual men or situations by an institution formed and mandated by government decree. The immigration depot at the Hyde Park Barracks closed in 1886. Raylene Francis tells us that even as official institutions moved out of the trade in women, the sex trade flourished in every late 19th century city in Australia. But even as the official trade in women had ended, its articulation has always been determined by government. And of course, we, their children, were impacted. Francis tells us the British government enacted the Contagious Diseases Act of the 1860s to provide a disease-free pool of women to trade sex to its troops. Similar edicts spread into the Australian colonies. To put this another way, 100 years after Governor Phillip was prepared to prostitute women and expose their children to predatory sexual narcissists in the aim of furthering empire, British and colonial authorities continued the process. Skates tells us that at the then going rate of 2 shillings and 6pence for a quickie, and 1 or 2 clients a day, a woman could earn more in a week than a skilled tailoress or a lady typist, and she could work from home where her children were. Hilary Golder and Judith Allen tell us that in the early 20th century, the policing of the sex trade took on a different tenor. In 1902, West Australian Attorney General Walter James argued it would be undesirable to entirely suppress prostitution, but I do not believe in it being carried on in an open, flagrant and almost insulting manner. Drive it off the streets. Make it invisible. We, their children, were invisible too. Unseen. The hand of government is always there. And the fate of children of sex workers in Australia under this governmentally mandated regime? We were forsaken, we were stolen, and we died. So, what about the children of the institutionally enforced whoredom that was early Australia? 6 children were born on that journey, on the journey from Britain to Sydney, and when they landed, there were some 36 children, 3.2% of the population. 11 years later, in December 1799, there were 862 children in Sydney. They made up 16.9% of the population. To put this another way, there were as many children in Sydney as there were women, and 3,385 men. Joanna Barnes became an unwed mother in Adelaide in the 1870s. She worked as a washerwoman, became a prostitute. She was turned out of her home by government action. She was arrested and jailed for prostitution. When that was done, no thought was given to her children. They were found wandering the streets. Joanna's 13-month-old son, Alfred, died in Port Adelaide and is buried in an unmarked grave there. She was told that her daughter also died, although she was lucky. She was adopted, stolen, by a family from New South Wales. The Australian story has never been collated, but there are odds and ends to be found by a diligent researcher. In August 1866, the Act for the Relief of Destitute Children, more commonly known as the Industrial Schools Act, was passed by the Government of New South Wales under the guidance of Henry Parkes. Power was given to the Governor to make regulations for the conduct, management and employment, education, correction and restraint of such children. Every child found lodging, living, bedding or wandering about in company with common prostitutes could be apprehended by any constable or peace officer or by any person and taken. What this tells us is that government policies created a truly awful situation that they sought to make invisible by containing it out of sight and out of mind. Other children? The web history of the infant's home in Sydney tells us that Sydney was a harsh city for unmarried mothers. Rejected by everyone, some women were forced into infanticide. The lucky children of what were called wayward women were incarcerated in industrial schools, orphanages and institutions like the infant's home in Darlinghurst, simply for the sin of being children of our mothers. Their guilt was taken for granted. What happens to children placed in institutional care where sin is assumed and penitence is demanded? In Ireland, 800 dead children from Magdalene laundries and orphanages were found dumped in a single septic tank. Dumping them with the shit tells us everything we need to know about how they were seen and treated. There are many more sites to be unearthed. The drive to containment led to the rise of the brothel as we know it today, and we can think about these brothels in many ways. The government approach is to see these as a form of acceptable containment. The sex trade is driven off the streets. Authoritarian controls can ensure a disease-free pool of accessible women. The trade can more easily be legitimised as a kind of work, and, in theory at least, harm minimised practices aimed at reducing the threats facing our mothers can be emplaced. Another way is to see our mothers coming under the kind of control that brings clusters of sexual narcissists, some of whom will be predators, into structural and ongoing proximity to our vulnerable mothers and their children. If you've read Mary's Child, you'll guess that as a child of a woman in the sex trade, I see this last effect as the most important, because this is all about the children. Even one predator can impact the lives of tens or hundreds of children. What do you think happens when sexual narcissists are brought together by the edicts of government and are free to explore their desires? Again, I must stress how dangerous it would be to children in this situation if we take the easy option and merely vilify our mothers or those who cluster around them. We have to see the whole production of they and the circumstances that the children are caught up in. That's uncomfortable. That hurts. That brings this very close to home because we are looking at the entire history and psychosocial sexual makeup that is Australia.